السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. المهاتما غاندي هل ما زال يشكل قوة حيوية في السياسة الهندية اليوم ومنارة أمل للمضطهدين والمهمشين في العالم؟ وما هي العلاقة المتينة بين العنف واللا عنف بنظره؟ وهل فعلا الحروب القديمة بدت أكثر أخلاقية من الصراعات اليوم؟ كتاب الهندي المستحيل، غاندي وإغراء العنف، من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعوا.
أولا يتجاهلونك، ثم يسخرون منك، ثم يحاربونك، ثم تنتصر. قائل هذا الكلام حير العالم بمقاومته اللاعنفية، كما حرك الأقلام بفكره. هو المهاتما بالسنسكريتية أو الروح العظيمة بالعربية. هو غاندي الأب والقائد السياسي والروحي. القائد الأول لحركة الاستقلال الهندية ومهندس نموذج من مظاهر العصيان المدني أثر في العالم. درس القانون وتمرس في الدفاع عن حقوق الهنود في الداخل الهندي وفي جنوب إفريقيا، حيث أمضى 20 عاما يناهض فيها التشريعات التمييزية بحق الهنود. نظم حملات المقاطعة ضد المؤسسات البريطانية باعتماد أسلوب الساتياغراها أو المقاومة من خلال العصيان المدني الجماعي اللاعنفي، وقاد مسيرة الملح الشهيرة إلى البحر التي بلغت 320 كيلومترا. ورغم ذلك لم يفلت من الاستهداف من قبل متطرف هندوسي قتله عام 48 من القرن الماضي، عندما كان المهاتما يسعى جاهدا لإنهاء صراع بين المسلمين والهندوس في ولاية البنغال الهندية. المهاتما فارق الحياة، لكن معتقداته وممارساته وثورته تبقى منارة أمل للمظلومين والمهمشين في كل أصقاع الأرض وينبوعا للمفكرين. المؤرخ الهندي في جامعة أكسفورد الأستاذ د.فيصل دفجي، المختص في الإسلام والعولمة والعنف وعلم الأخلاق، ومؤلف كتاب الهندي المستحيل، غاندي وإغراء العنف، يكشف لنا مدى أهمية غاندي للسياسة الهندية اليوم وللمضطهدين في العالم، ويحدثنا عن جانب جديد في شخصية المهاتما وفي مقاومته، ويعلل ازدراء غاندي للتاريخ وإصراره على وصف السجل التاريخي بأنه يتحدث عن العنف ويبرره.
Indian historian, reader in Indian history at St. Antony's College, the University of Oxford, D.Fayzal Devji, welcome to the Inside.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome, sir. Now, Dr. Devji, your book, The Impossible Indian, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence, was described as an audacious book because of your approach, because you approach Gandhi counterintuitively, and you tend to explore something which you call the temptation of violence in Gandhi. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yes, I thought it would be important and interesting to discover or rediscover Gandhi as a political thinker. And I think this is important because he's been made into a saint. And that was precisely what Gandhi was not.
The Mahatma.
The Mahatma. Mm-hmm. To make the Mahatma into a saint is in fact to defang him and to just place him on a shelf somewhere where you can worship him. And that's, I think, the wrong way to approach him, because he was an incredibly radical figure in his own time. And what I meant by the temptation of violence was not that Gandhi was himself tempted by violence, but that he tempted violence, which is to say that he thought that the only reason that violence could be transformed into non-violence was because the two were in fact connected in some sense, that violence and non-violence were intimately connected, which allowed for the conversion from one into the other. And of those two terms, violence is the positive term. Non-violence is a negative term, you can see by the word itself, non-violence. So non-violence only gets its reality from violence itself. So for Gandhi, non-violence was not about running away from violence.
This is more of a philosophical view,
yes,
not just a political one, right?
Yes, I think that it's both political and philosophical. And that's, I think, the richness of Gandhi's thought and action, because he was not really interested in politics in its own right. He thought, in fact, that politics was taking over the whole of Indian society in British times, and that this was a very unhealthy thing, because it transformed all human relations into instrumental relations, into relations where people wanted to use each other to achieve certain ends. So what he wanted to do was to set a limit to politics, but to do so, he had to, as he's put it, to spiritualize politics. So he entered politics in order to limit it and to spiritualize it at the same time. So perhaps I can say something about what he meant by the relationship of violence and non-violence, by giving you an example.
It's a difficult thing to understand. How can you relate violence and non-violence at the same time? You say that if you speak about non-violence, you have to understand that it's the opposite of violence.
Well, let me give you an example to clarify what I mean. So Gandhi often invoked an important Sanskrit text, the ancient text called the Bhagavad Gita, which is the account of a great war between two groups of cousins. So it's a family that has been split apart. And the hero who goes into this war doesn't want to fight and eventually is compelled to fight. And Gandhi sees it in the following way. He says, look, the point about war and violence is that we think of it as evil, and we see one army as a good army and the other army as the evil army. But in fact, evil also requires goodness to survive. And this is what he meant, that for an army to survive, its soldiers need to have virtues, moral virtues, like courage, like friendship, like loyalty to their leaders and to their fellow soldiers. And these things are virtues. In other words, these soldiers are not necessarily fighting because they are dedicated to an evil cause. They are often fighting because they have made promises to friends, because they have signed an oath of loyalty, because they want to display their courage.
Because they think perhaps their side is good, is the good side, for example.
They might think so, but his point is, even if they don't think that, they can still fight in this war. And
out of duty, perhaps.
Out of duty. So what he thinks is that evil only survives upon goodness, because if these soldiers were all evil, if they were interested only in themselves, in their self-interest, they would never fight. They would run away at the first sign of danger.
Yes.
They would not be loyal to their friends. The fact that an army holds together out of virtue means that it's only goodness that it's based upon. It's not evil. So the task of the non-violent soldier then is to withdraw goodness from evil. And once you withdraw goodness from it, it collapses. And so the whole point of a non-violent soldier is to display the virtues of courage, loyalty, friendship, and bravery in a greater fashion, in a more adequate and morally meaningful way than the soldiers of evil are able to do. And in this way, one is able to withdraw goodness from evil, and evil collapses, and that's what he calls non-cooperation.
Now, we all know that the 21 years that Gandhi has spent in South Africa has been the period during which his intellectual political mind has matured and developed, but it's still a black box to most of us. We don't know much about this except from certain contributions from his secretary and perhaps others. But in your book, you tend to call Gandhi and describe him as the impossible man. What did your book offer or attempt to tell us about Gandhi that there is something we don't know about to make him an impossible man?
Well, I use the word impossible, colloquially, idiomatically in English. You can often describe someone who's very frustrating as, oh, that is impossible, you say. A pet animal like a cat, that cat is impossible. It's constantly going and upsetting things, my plants or my dishes or something. So you can use the word impossible affectionately, not only critically. And what I meant by calling Gandhi the impossible Indian was that he, in his entire life, what he ended up doing was turning everyone's perceptions on their heads. He was the one who was counterintuitive, not me in a sense. That he simply tried to break the spell of what people at that time in British India received as a norm. They took it for granted that the British should rule India. They took it for granted that their future should be just like England, that they should gradually evolve so that India can become like England. They took all of these things for granted, and Gandhi's task was to break that spell, that magic spell, by literally turning everything upside down on its head. And in that sense, he was impossible because he refused to follow the norms of the day. So, for instance, whereas normally nationalist fighters for freedom or revolutionary fighters for freedom employ the language of, a forward advance military language. We need to capture the state. We need to take over rule. Gandhi, what did he do? He said, we must withdraw. We must non-cooperate. We must be non-violent. So his mode of operation was non-violent. It was about withdrawal rather than forward movement. And he thought that by withdrawing, your enemy will collapse. And you will also allow or make possible the conversion of your enemy to your ways of seeing things. So you see, even his modus operandi, his way of political maneuvering, seemed to be so counterintuitive, seemed to be in such stark contrast to what everyone else was saying, including Indian nationalists and revolutionaries, that they often threw up their hands and said, like the British said, what an impossible man. How are we to deal with this man who raises a great movement by doing very simple things like spinning? Everyone spins, and the British are thinking to themselves, what on earth is this? Or the famous salt tax, which he protested. He said salt. The
demonstration, yes.
That
the
salt
demonstration
is a necessity of life, and the British are taxing it. Notice this form of protest. It's only walking. You just walk. How can you arrest someone for walking? And people join in, and they peel off, and everyone can participate. Women, children, elderly people, young people, Muslims, Hindus, Christians, Sikhs, Jains, upper class people, lower class people. Everyone can be brought together, but without being regimented. They don't all have to do the same thing at the same time. A very simple act which completely transforms political mobilization.
Right. To what extent do you think, Dr. Dafji, that Gandhi is still affecting the Indian politics today and also affecting the deprived, the oppressed, the sidelined across the world?
In some ways, he's more influential outside India than he is within it.
Pity.
It's a pity. But that's partly because, as I said earlier, he has been made into a saint. So it's very easy for people like President Obama to refer to Gandhi as an inspiration. It means nothing in some senses. I hope it means something for him. But politically, it means nothing because you don't see the American president's politics as being informed by anything Gandhi said, though he claims him. So everyone can claim this man. He's become globally notorious. In some parts of the world, he is a real presence, a real influence. In many parts of the Middle East, in the events of the so-called Arab Spring, you have had Gandhi's posters and photographs and words on display. In Bahrain, for instance. It's very, very interesting for me to see that. In India itself, even those who are against Gandhi, who dislike Gandhi, are forced to use his model.
So he's indispensable to Indian politics today?
Even and especially for his enemies. So there has been no popular mobilization.
In what sense to his enemies, for example?
In the sense that even those who are, say, Hindu nationalists, when they seek to mobilize people on a philosophy of hatred for other religions, they can only do so by deploying Gandhian forms, like these great processions, and often by explicitly referring to Gandhi himself. And then, of course, there are those who are technically not against Gandhi and who cite him all the time, but who you wouldn't think Gandhi would have approved of. But the most interesting thing, I think, all the great women's movements and the movements for the protection of the environment have drawn on Gandhi. Very important and interesting fact. Right.
Now, Dr. Dafji, in your book you argue that for Gandhi, sovereignty and its validation lies not in the state, but within the ethical self. How?
You know, when Gandhi was writing, and indeed this is the case today as well, people in many parts of the world, in the colonial world, were told, you people are too quarrelsome, you fight with each other, and you are not civilized enough to become free. You are not qualified to be a democratic country. You have to wait, you have to be educated. And Gandhi argued, this is incorrect. everyone is always already ready to be free. Not only that, the freedom needn't be collective. It needn't be that you need to wait for 50 years. You can have a struggle for 50 years. Gandhi had a struggle for nearly 50 years. But you can achieve freedom immediately in your person, in yourself, individually. And he said freedom lies in the palm of your hand. If you are able to govern yourself, in what way? By rejecting, even at the risk of being persecuted and going to jail, by rejecting a rule that you consider unjust, you have already become free. So for him, freedom was not simply the creation of a new state and democracy. It started with the individual and it ended with the individual as well. It was crucial that it should be within the experience of individuals, that individuals
from
should
the
not
inner
be,
self.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay, Dr. Faisal, we're going to stop now for a short break, and then when we come back, we will discuss more how some other side or other type of people considered that his quest for freedom did not get materialized. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا.
المؤرخ الهندي الدكتور فيصل دفجي كيف يقرأ رأي من يقول إن أفعال المهاتما غاندي أخرت نيل الهنود الحرية، وأن غاندي السياسي أخفق في تحقيق هدفه وهو الوصول إلى بلد حر وموحد؟ ولماذا يعد من الصعوبة بمكان على الهنود أن ينهلوا من فكر غاندي وتعاليمه؟
True in some sense, though I would argue, as I think Gandhi would, that freedom merely seen as the gaining power over a state was not true freedom. So he argued with the Indian revolutionaries of his time, look, if all you want to do is take over from the British, then you just let the British stay. And he put it in these terms: you want the tiger's nature, the tiger is the British. You want the nature of the tiger, but you don't want the tiger. You yourself want to become the tiger. There is no point in this. If you want freedom, it must be something qualitatively different from the freedom that is claimed by your oppressors. You cannot simply want to replace the British. Freedom must be something else. It must be something alternative. It must be something new that can be a model for others in the world, including for the British themselves. So he thought that freedom achieved too quickly, simply by taking over the state, was not worth the name. It would simply be perpetuating British rule. And you might argue, as you suggest, that in fact when India did become free, it ended up perpetuating many sections of, or many aspects of British rule. That's true today. A lot of the penal code of India.
Because violence, you know, erupted back then and stayed for like 3 decades.
Yes. Yes, I would not describe India as a Gandhian paradise. It's true. So there has been a failure at that level. But
why is it, excuse me, Dr. Dakhel, why is it so difficult for the Indians to learn from this fountain of Gandhi and actually to bring into practice the things that he long talked about?
I think one of the reasons has to do with the fact that it's incredibly difficult to break the magic spell, as I was describing it, of common sense, often British or Western views of what freedom is and of what power should be. And that people are so wedded to these that they are unable to actually reconsider the nature of political power. So for Gandhi, for instance, he thought that not only should individuals embody freedom in themselves as individuals, but that the only reason why India or Indians were able to refuse to cooperate with the British was because India was pluralistic and diverse. Because India was pluralistic and diverse, divided into different religions, castes, communities, languages, etc., each of these units governed itself, right? They were self-governing in many ways. And this is what allowed them to non-cooperate with the British. So everything that modern Indians often see as a problem with India, it's too diverse. It's too fractious. Gandhi thought was actually a strength of Indian civilization. But that realization has not really sunk in. So there's great fear of the diversity of India, which is why people from all different walks of life want to homogenize it. They want, everyone to be the same in some ways, or they want a hierarchy in which some people are oppressed and others rule them, which they think is for the sake of the country, for the good of the country.
Right. Now, why do you believe, Dr. Dafji, that Gandhi was a philosophical anarchist?
Well, he described himself as that. He was an anarchist not because he was like the anarchists of his day, but because he didn't believe that the state should have complete control over society. He thought that one should rely much more strongly on people's cultural, religious, and other traditions, linguistic, ethnic distinctions and traditions. That if you get rid of tradition, you can reform tradition, but if you get rid of it, then people become like playthings in the hands of the state. There's nothing to resist the force of a dictatorship. So he put much greater stress on the non-political aspects of life, the way in which what people have inherited shapes the way they are, how they behave with each other. They can always, of course, educate themselves further. They can always learn more. So instead of homogenizing them all in the same way, he thought that the important thing was that Muslims should be good Muslims, Hindus should be good Hindus, atheists should be good atheists. And as long as they were true to themselves, they didn't need to have a system that was true for everyone. They would actually come together in some organic fashion. It seems like a curious way of thinking, but I think he demonstrated its truth in his own lifetime.
Now let's talk a bit about the personality of the Mahatma, because some researchers say, quote, that this divide between the religious, spiritual Gandhi and the political one, or more aptly the divide between Gandhi, the Ashramite, and Gandhi, the Satyagrahi, has come to shape not only our academic engagement with the life and thought of Gandhi, but also our memory of the man whom we revere, revile, or remain indifferent to. So what can you tell us about this dichotomy? Or is it a kind of a state of coherence between this political trend and religious trend inside Gandhi that affected his philosophy?
Yes, that has been a huge sticking point for all of Gandhi's doubters and enemies, that they thought that he had, for instance, the man who becomes the president of the Muslim League and who goes on to found Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, very interesting and complicated character in his own right, but he castigated Gandhi for mixing religion with politics. Now you might think this is a strange thing for the leader of a party called the Muslim League to say, but he was very worried that Gandhi just seemed to flip very easily from the realm of religion or society to that of politics. And what Jinnah wanted were clear distinctions. And this has continued to be a problem, both among Gandhi's friends. So, secularists would like to see a secular Gandhi. Religious Hindus would like to see a religious... They
like to brand him with their own brands. Right. And now, Gandhi is one of the, or perhaps the only political figure who disdained history to the extent of recommending that the people forget their past. What does he mean actually by that? Because, people tend always to say, and even politicians, they say that, well, history is repeating itself and we should learn from the mistakes or the messages that was in our history.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating aspect of Gandhi. He, of course, as I said, admired tradition. So he didn't mean that you forget your tradition, but he thought history as a way of thinking, as a way of judging the present and the future, was problematic for two reasons. One, because, as I suggested, the British used history to say that Indians and other people were not yet ready for their independence. They had to proceed like the Europeans had through a certain history, Industrial Revolution, etc., etc. So for them, they used history to keep people down by making a hierarchy of civilizations. But for Gandhi, the other aspect is more important. He realized very soon that in the 19th and 20th centuries, history provided not only explanations for violence, but the language of
justification, actually,
justification
for violence.
For violence, and that the language of hatred is so historical. People say, we have been oppressed in the past by you, that you have done this to us 1,000 years ago. You know, so that history becomes crucial to thinking about violence and to making violence possible. And he therefore thought that it was a tool of imperialism, and it also provided the language and explanation for violence. And therefore people should actually not consider it, because it was also a 19th century or 18th century modern Western way of thinking about the world.
Right. Now, one last question, if I may, and briefly, if I may ask. No library in the country has the complete collection of Indian Opinion, which is a journal that Gandhi owned, founded, and also ran, and which was also the main organ of the struggle in South Africa. Why was this so poorly archived in Indian libraries or in the libraries of India?
You know, I think this is being remedied now, and you know, a number of books have come out recently on Gandhi's South African period. But you know, people have focused mostly on the Indian period of Gandhi's life and seen the South African period.
Though he spent like 21 years in South Africa.
And they've seen the South African period simply as a kind of preparatory work, and I think that's entirely wrong. The important thing about South Africa is that it demonstrates to Gandhi himself that his struggle is not a parochial struggle. It's not simply about Indians or for India. That it started out as an imperial struggle, a struggle against the empire itself, and therefore a global struggle, potentially. And that in South Africa, he could rely upon and mobilize people of different faiths and different races. And it's also what made him not a nationalist in the conventional sense.
Right.
He was interested in the universal purchase of his ideas. He was very interested in the Middle East and in the Palestinian problem, for instance, and in many other world affairs and events.
Indian historian and reader in Indian history at St. Anthony's College, the University of Oxford, D.فيصل, دفجي, many thanks indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net. من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.